Alabama Crimson Tide fans, let me tell you something. Maybe we're looking at the wrong player when we think about the true freshman who could surprise Alabama in 2026. And the most curious part is that the name I want to put at the center of this conversation isn't one of the five-star headliners of the class. It's not E.J. Crowell, and it's not one of those players who arrives surrounded by hype from the recruiting process. I'm talking about Trayshawn Brown. And I'll go further. If this kid confirms in the fall what he already showed during spring practice, there's a real possibility he sees the field a lot more than most people are currently imagining. But there's a problem. His path to the field is crowded with players who are already ahead of him in the pecking order. So the big question is, how does a three-star recruit find room in such a stacked backfield? That's exactly what could make Trayshawn Brown one of the most interesting storylines for Alabama this season. And before I continue, if you're an Alabama fan and want to follow all the news, rumors, and players who could make a difference for the Crimson Tide in 2026, subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications too, because I'll be bringing you the information that can really change the way we look at this season. Now, let's get straight to it. Alabama's 2026 recruiting class arrived with big expectations. The Crimson Tide finished among the top 5 classes in the country according to 24/7 Sports rankings, with 27 commitments and 4 recruits rated 5 stars: E.J. Crowell, Xavier Griffin, Jordan Edmonds, and Jere Edwards. It's an extremely talented class, and naturally the spotlight is on the biggest names. But college football doesn't run on recruiting stars alone. Sometimes a 3-star player joins a huge program, puts in the work, seizes an opportunity, and ends up carving out a role nobody expected. That's exactly why I want to pay attention to Trayshawn Brown. The running back from Huntsville, Texas, doesn't arrive at Alabama with the same buzz as Crowell. When you look at the position, it's natural for fans to talk first about the more well-known names and the ones already carrying bigger expectations. But Brown started showing during spring practice that he might have something different to offer. And that, to me, is the detail worth paying attention to. Because it's one thing for a player to be considered a promising prospect on paper. It's a completely different thing for him to step on the field and show signs that he can compete, physically and technically, with more experienced players. Brown already had a chance to show a bit of that potential during spring practice, and now comes the part that could change this whole story: fall training camp. That's where I want to watch this player closely. Alabama has a backfield loaded with talent. That means Brown won't have an easy path. Quite the opposite. He'll need to make the most of every opportunity, every rep, every moment he gets on the field. It's not enough to be fast or talented. He'll need to prove he can be trusted when the level of competition rises. And that's exactly where I think this story gets interesting. Because maybe Brown doesn't need to start the season as a starter to have an impact. That's an important distinction. When people talk about a freshman making an impact, a lot of folks immediately picture that player as a starter from game 1. I don't necessarily see it that way. In Brown's case, the impact could start in a much quieter fashion. First, a few opportunities, then a few plays, maybe some specific situations where Alabama needs speed, explosiveness, or simply a change of pace in the backfield. And if he makes the most of those chances, things could start to shift. That's how a player who arrives as a 3-star recruit can completely transform the perception people have of him. Today, when people talk about the true freshman who could make a difference for Alabama in 2026, there are much more obvious names. E.J. Crowell, for example, naturally gets a lot of attention, but Brown could be exactly the guy who emerges from behind the spotlight. And I like that kind of story, because there isn't the same pressure on him. He doesn't have to step onto the field carrying the expectation of being the Crimson Tide's next big star. He just has to prove he belongs. And sometimes it's exactly that type of player who ends up surprising everyone. What really stands out to me is that Alabama doesn't need to put the whole weight of the offense on his shoulders. That can actually be a good thing. Brown can develop gradually, learn the system, learn from more experienced teammates, and take advantage of the moments the coaching staff decides to give him a shot. And if he keeps developing the way he did in the spring, I wouldn't be surprised if the name Trayshawn Brown started coming up more and more in conversations throughout the fall. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. I'm not saying Brown is simply going to take over Alabama's backfield. That would be an exaggeration to claim right now. The competition is tough, and there are players with far more experience and hype behind them. What I am saying is that there's a real possibility he could be a surprise, and that's already enough to keep my eye on him. Because picture the scenario.
Alabama starts the season using its top running backs, but at some point Brown gets his opportunity. He comes in, makes an explosive play, shows he can handle contact, demonstrates speed, and most importantly, earns the coaching staff's trust. From there, everything can change. One opportunity can turn into a few plays can turn into a rotation, and a rotation can turn an unknown freshman into a real piece of the offense. That's why I believe Trayshawn Brown deserves to be watched closely. Alabama built one of the most talented classes in the country, but it's not always the 5 stars that tell the whole story of a season. Sometimes the player who starts out far from the spotlight ends up being the one who wins fans over once he finally gets his shot. And now Brown is about to get exactly that chance. Fall camp is going to be crucial. That's where we'll start to find out whether what he showed in the spring was just a good sign, or if there's real potential for him to break into the Alabama's rotation in 2026. In my opinion, I wouldn't count this kid out. Quite the opposite. If he keeps developing, I believe we're going to hear the name Trayshawn Brown a lot more throughout the season. Maybe he won't be Alabama's top star right out of the gate. Maybe he won't even start as one of the top names in the backfield. But there's room for him to grow, and if he can seize the right opportunities, he could end up being one of the surprises of the 2026 class. Now, I want to hear from you, Alabama Crimson Tide fans. Do you believe Trayshawn Brown can really earn playing time and make an impact as soon as the 2026 season, even coming in as a 3-star recruit? Or do you think the competition in the backfield is too tough and he'll need to wait another season for his big shot? I want your opinion. Drop a comment below because I really want to know what Crimson Tide fans are thinking about this player before the season kicks off.